You're tuned into the Spot Up Pod, the official podcast of the Spot Up Shot newsletter. I'm your host, Paul Garcia. In today's episode, Dylan Harper sustained an injury that might force him to miss training camp and the preseason. Should the Spurs extend the contract of Jeremy Sochan? Stanley Umude joins the training camp roster for the Spurs. How's it going, everyone? It's been about 2 weeks since I last recorded an episode of the Spot Up Pod, but let's jump into some of the most recent news that came out on Friday. According to the San Antonio Spurs on Friday, the team announced that Dylan Harper, the rookie guard who was drafted number 2 overall in the 2025 NBA draft, underwent successful surgery to repair a partial tear of the collateral ligament in his left thumb after he sustained the injury in an offseason workout on Wednesday in San Antonio. The Spurs did not provide a timetable yet for Harper's return. However, Shams Charania of ESPN reported that the hope is that he'll be ready by opening night on October 22nd in Dallas, Texas. And then Jeff McDonald of the San Antonio Express News echoed this, writing that the injury could force Harper to miss his first NBA training camp and the entire preseason. So again, some unfortunate injury news for Harper as he begins his rookie career with the San Antonio Spurs. So I want to look at 2 questions here after this news came out, and I wrote about this over on the spotupshot.com on Friday. The first question impacts Harper himself. How does this injury impact Harper? And the second question is, how does the injury impact the team? So let's first begin with Harper. So because it's a hand injury, a finger injury, Harper might still be able to do some conditioning drills, such as like running activities whenever he's cleared for that. But he's gonna be a little bit rusty in the basketball part of this in terms of being able to do like shooting drills, dribbling drills, because he's not going to have access to that hand, or he's going to be limited into what he can do with that left hand. So again, that's gonna make him a little bit rusty to start the season whenever he's eventually cleared. Also, he's going to miss that opportunity to be out on the floor with his teammates in training camp in the preseason to build that chemistry, whether he was going to be with some of the starters or whether he was going to be coming off the bench. Again, he's missing that key time of chemistry to build with his new teammates and running some of their sets and kind of just figuring things out on the floor. So when he is eventually cleared to play, though, he's also going to have very little time to ramp up and get ready for game level play, considering this will be his first time getting into NBA games where whenever he's cleared, whether that's opening night against Dallas, he's going to get thrown into the fire there against real meaningful minutes, going against better competition than he played in those few summer league games that he did play in. So again, it's very unfortunate for Harper that he is going to begin training camp in the preseason on the injured list and maybe be back by opening night, but at least it's not an injury that's going to be really keep him out for months or even the entire season, like was the case unfortunately for Oklahoma City Thunder center Thomas Sorber, who is going to be out for the entire season due to an injury. So again, unfortunate for Harper, but he will eventually get cleared here to play in a few weeks, and he should be ready to go hopefully by opening night. Now let's talk about how Harper's injury does impact the team. Before, if you've been, listening to this podcast and also reading my writing over on the spotupshot.com, I have been kind of in pencil. I've had a starting lineup looking like, I've projected the starting lineup to look like this. De'Aaron Fox at the 1, Stephon Castle at the 2, Devin Vassell at the 3, Harrison Barnes at the 4, and Victor Wembanyama at the 5. But I did think that Harper had a chance to possibly compete with Stephon Castle for that other guard role next to De'Aaron Fox in the backcourt. However, now that Harper is going to be out most likely for training camp in the preseason, that's likely going to go to that role's likely going to go to Castle. So there's again not much debate there anymore. And so I do expect Harper, whenever he eventually is cleared to play in a backup role off the bench at one of those guard spots. Harper's injury, though, does open up some opportunity for 3 players in the guard position and off the bench, and that's Jordan McLaughlin, the veteran point guard on the Spurs, David Jones-Garcia, who was signed to a 2-way contract and really broke out in Summer League, and then also one of the training camp invites, Adam Flagler, formerly of the Oklahoma City Thunder. So again, there might be a backup point guard minutes there in the training camp in the preseason until Harper eventually gets cleared to play for one of those 3 players to compete for minutes. Right now, again, I would say McLaughlin is a safe option where he's a veteran player, has been in the league for a number of years, was also on the Spurs since February last year, kind of knows the system, knows some of the players out there. He's more so a safe option where he's not going to be too risky. He's just going to kind of get out there, put the team in their sets, and then shoot open threes if they're there for him. Someone like David Jones-Garcia, he has a lot of upside, as we saw in the Summer League, but this is also a new environment for him, playing with new teammates, playing against better competition out in the preseason compared to some of the players he played against out there in Summer League. And then someone like Flagler, this opens up an opportunity to possibly maybe try to not only just like try to get those backup point guard minutes, but again, for Flagler, someone like him, he's on a training camp contract, so he's actually trying to make the full team here with one open standard spot. So again, this is a big opportunity for those three players, at least until Harper eventually gets cleared to return to the team, if that's in the regular season. Also, the Spurs, when the regular season does begin, if Harper's not ready, I could also see them, starting with Fox and Castle in the starting backcourt, but then having those players stagger their minutes where one of them is on the floor for most of the game. Staggering their minutes throughout the early part of the season until Harper is eventually cleared to return. If the Spurs don't want to go with a more traditional guard option, they could also look for some wing players to get some extra minutes in preseason and training camps, such as Carter Bryant and Lindy Waters III. All right, up for our next topic, let's look at whether or not the Spurs should extend the contract of Jeremy Sochan. So on Friday, I wrote a piece called Extension Options for the Spurs and Jeremy Sochan. So in that piece, I examined, some key questions about the Spurs and Sochan, really, with the team and Sochan facing an October 20th deadline to ink an extension if both sides have interest in a contract extension. Again, October 20th is that deadline, the day before the regular season begins. So in that piece, I began by discussing, the skills that Sochan has already shown out on the floor on defense and offense. Being a very good defender, offensively, being a good connector with the ball in his hands, a playmaker, being able to kind of play in the dunker spot, roll, and finish pretty well at the rim. But obviously, we know that the area where he really needs to improve on offense is with his outside shooting. So from there, I after kind of discussing his skills out on the court, then I went to looking at some contract extension options. So let's begin with three different options. The low, I guess like the starting point of negotiations, maybe like the highest amount. Looking at that kind of scenario, and then kind of like that middle ground, finding that middle ground for Sochan and the Spurs. So if we're talking about like a starting point, I think the non-tax mid-level exception is that starting point. So for next year, 26-27, that would be $15 million or 9% of the salary cap. So in here, I looked at deals where I calculated 8% raises for Sochan for 2 to 5 year deals. So basically, starts off in 26-27 at $15 million, then it goes up to $16 million, $17.5 million, $18.7 million, and $19.9 million, depending on the number of years. And then what those deals look like, again, at the end, the non-tax MLE, that's 2 years for $31 million, 3 years for $48.8 million, 4 years for $67.4 million, and then 5 years for $87.3 million. So again, I think that's a starting point if the Spurs and Sochan we're going to start looking at a contract extension. Is one of those, maybe the non-tax MLE amount, and for one of those year options, whether it's a 2-year deal to maybe a 4-year deal or 5-year deal, et cetera. Next, I looked at, what's one of the higher extension amounts to look at for Sochan. I think the player to use here for an example is 22 draftee, fellow draftee for Sochan, Jabari Smith Jr., who plays on the Houston Rockets. So in July, Smith Jr. signed a 5-year, $122 million rookie extension with the Rockets, which basically is about 12 to 14% of the salary cap in the next 5 years. So Smith's deal goes from a low end of $21.8 million to a high end of $27.4 million during those 5 years. How this would look if those numbers went into a deal for Sochan, we would say a 2-year deal for $45.4 million, 3-year deal for $69 million, 4-year deal for $94.6 million, or a 5-year deal for $122 million. But from the Spurs' perspective, maybe they don't want to go, quite yet to the numbers that Smith Jr. got, considering that, even though Smith Jr. and Sochan are very good defenders on their teams, Smith has a little bit more on the offensive end in terms of the fact that he has an established jump shot already from outside, and that's still a part of the game that Sochan's kind of developing. Plus, the Rockets have got to see what Smith can do in a more competitive environment, considering that the Rockets, the season before, just barely missed the playoffs, and then last season we saw them get into the playoffs, even though they got knocked out pretty early. The Rockets have at least seen Sochan in a tested environment, in a playoff level environment, whereas Sochan, the hope is this coming season that the Spurs are finally in that environment, in that playoff level environment, instead of being just a lottery bound team like they've been the last few years here that Sochan has been on the team. So again, I think that there's some argument for the Spurs' perspective not to give Sochan those numbers where Smith Jr.'s at in his contract, whether that's a 2 to 5 year deal. So then we look at, what's the middle ground, kind of what's that in between the non-tax MLE, which is 8% of the salary cap, and the high end, which is a Jabari Smith Jr. deal, which is 12 to 14% of the cap. And so there, I think it's about 10 to 11% of the salary cap, which would basically be about $16.5 million at 10% of the salary cap. So if the Spurs and Sochan agreed here, In 26-27, he'd get 16.5 million. Then it goes up to 17.8 million the second year, 19.1 million the third year, 20.5 million the fourth year, and then 21.8 million in the fifth year. Again, these are with 8% raises. A 2 to 5 year example of this looks like 2 years for 34 million, 3 years for 53.5 million, 4 years for 73.9 million, and then 5 years for 95.7 million. And again, here, the reason why I say this is middle ground is because Sochan and his agent, they're seeing that, the Spurs aren't just offering the lowest amount, which is like the non-text MLE. Instead, they're going a little bit above that, something that, that another team in free agency would need to give him with cap space. And plus, even if things don't work out in the after like the first year of this deal, it's a pretty good contract where the Spurs can also, if Sochan eventually wants to move on or the Spurs want to move on from him, they can look at trading him down the road if things aren't working out and he's not, developing to the player that they hope he could develop into, or maybe his role's not where the role's not there for him where maybe he wants it after a few years with the Spurs. So again, I think that's like the middle ground amount. And so should the Spurs and Sochan agree to an extension within the next month and a half, I do think kind of maybe either the non-text MLE amount is that range, or maybe this middle ground amount is kind of where they decide on if they both have interest. Again, I don't think they get to that Jabari Smith Jr. Type numbers in an extension if one is agreed upon between both sides. Now, what happens though if no deal is agreed upon? Let's look at two different scenarios here. Or options here. So if the Spurs and Sochan don't agree to an extension by October 20th, then on July 1st, 2026, next summer, the Spurs can tender Sochan a $9.6 million qualifying offer so he can become a restricted free agent. So in this scenario, Sochan's going out into restricted free agency, and he's seeing, will another team give him an amount at the non-text MLE, which is $15 million, or are they willing to go even higher and dip into their cap space, if they have any cap space, to give him an amount, maybe like at 16.5 million, 18 million, 20 million, somewhere around there. So for the Spurs, this option's pretty good for them too, because now they're basically letting the market kind of dictate what salary Sochan's going to get. And so, Sochan goes out into restricted free agency. If he finds an offer sheet that he likes from another team, he signs that offer sheet. Then that offer sheet goes back to the Spurs, and now San Antonio has a choice here. They have 48 hours to decide, do we want to match that amount and have Sochan back on the team for whatever the terms are of that deal, or is it too much money that Sochan's getting from this new team and the Spurs like, no, we're okay. They could just allow him to go sign with that team. So again, this is a scenario where the Spurs, have it a little bit of both ways, where they can kind of see, where they can kind of let the market kind of figure out what numbers Sochan's going to get from a different team, and then if they like those numbers, they can match it themselves and keep Sochan on the team, or they can let him walk. Let's just say though that Sochan doesn't find an offer he likes from another team, or the Spurs and him are not on the same page in terms of getting a new contract done. Well, then he could go to the most extreme route, which is something that Cam Thomas of the Brooklyn Nets just did this past summer, and that is sign a qualifying offer with the Spurs, where he's back on San Antonio for next season, 26-27, on a 1-year deal for $9.6 million. But he's very limited in terms of what his next contract could look like. And even though he would have a say if the Spurs were to trade him during the season, if an acquired team got him, they could only re-sign him with a certain number, because he has limited bird rights in that scenario, similar to the situation that Cam Thomas is in coming up with the Brooklyn Nets. And not only that, Sochan has to play well to get a good offer in free agency the following summer as an unrestricted free agent, and he has to stay healthy throughout the season. So again, that's the most risky move, I would say, for Sochan's perspective, to go into restricted to sign the qualifying offer, just because there's a lot at stake here if that happens. So an extension also might not be automatic from the Spurs' perspective, I would say, because of what their salary cap sheet is going to look like in the coming years. We got to remember that they just signed De'Aaron Fox to a 30% max extension for the next 4 years back in August. So that's going to be kicking in next season in 26-27. Then in 27-28, Victor Wembanyama's eventual extension will kick in. The following summer in 28-29, an extension for Stephon Castle would kick in if he and the Spurs agree to an extension. And then in that fourth year, 29-30, extensions for Dylan Harper and Carter Bryant can begin if the Spurs and Harper and Bryant agree to extensions as well. So again, the fact that there's more players coming up here on the Spurs' roster, with extensions, could be a reason why San Antonio kind of withholds, giving Sochan an extension right now, and instead maybe letting him go into restricted free agency and find a new deal with another team, and then either matching that or not. So again, all in all, if there is an extension in these next, up until October 20th with the Spurs and Sochan, I do expect it to either be at that non-tax MLE amount or that 10 to 11% amount, which is about the middle ground amount. I don't expect it to be in the Jabari Smith Jr. kind of realm. Or if there's not an extension, well, then I could again see that other perspective of the Spurs kind of letting the market next summer dictate what kind of numbers Sochan gets an extension, and then they can decide whether or not they want to match that extension. So one thing to note is that the Spurs, when they do sign players to extensions, rookie extensions at least, they typically announce those in October. I went back and looked at some of their transactions, and the most recent ones for DeJounte Murray and Devin Vassell weren't announced until July. I mean, not until July, until October for their rookie extensions. And I know that Keldon Johnson and Derek White got extensions as well on rookie extensions, but those were more so during those COVID years when the off seasons were kind of off the calendars. So those did happen in July. But again, during normal regular seasons that we're used to, like how the calendar is currently in progress right now, if an extension is decided between the Spurs and Sochan, it's likely to come out or be announced in sometime in October. Let's keep going. All right, so for our final topic, let's discuss the recent signing of Stanley Umude for a training camp contract with the Spurs. So on Tuesday, the Spurs signed 6'6" wing player Stanley Umude, formerly of the Milwaukee Bucks, to a training camp contract. Umude joins Micah Potter and Adam Flagler as three players now on training camp deals with the Spurs. With Umude, the Spurs now have 20 players on the roster for training camp and the preseason. They can add up to one more player for training camp, but by October 20th, the day before opening night begins, the roster must be reduced to 15 players on standard contracts and 3 players on two-way contracts. So basically, 18 players by opening night has to be the number. So basically, for Umude, Micah Potter, and Adam Flagler, these 3 players could potentially be competing for that final standard roster spot the Spurs currently have on their team. Or if not, if Umude eventually gets waived here in the next month and a half, then I could see him also joining the Austin Spurs in the G League whenever their season begins in November. Just some quick background on Umude, who he is. So he's 26 years old. He has 3 years of NBA experience with the Detroit Pistons and the Milwaukee Bucks. He played in 22 games with the Bucks last season, though it was very limited minutes, 3.9 minutes per game. And a lot of the times when I was watching some of the film on him, a lot of his minutes were coming in garbage time when games had already been decided. According to cleaningtheglass.com, he primarily plays small forward, but he played some shooting guard as well with the Bucks. He's mainly an outside shooter when you look at his shot profile. I know that in his limited data with the Bucks, his accuracy wasn't very good, but again, that's kind of where he takes his shots from, is more so an outside shooter first, then maybe just the mid-range, and then finally to the rim. One thing I noticed when watching some of the clips on his shots is he uses the hop motion with his shot. And then he had some good defensive possessions with the Bucks, in some of the clips that I watched on defense. But again, it's hard to evaluate because a lot of those times, he was playing in garbage time when those, when maybe like the energy levels for the other team are not, as aggressive, considering that the game's already decided. So I will say that it is going to be a tall task, a challenge for Umude to earn a roster spot, a standard spot with the Spurs, because they have multiple wings already on this team, and some of these players aren't even going to get minutes on a nightly basis. So players that are kind of locked into the rotation most likely are Devin Vassell, Keldon Johnson, maybe Julian Champagnie, but then you have players like Lindy Waters III competing for minutes. You have rookie Carter Bryant trying to compete for minutes. So again, that's 5 wing players on this team already that I think Umude's trying to battle with to even try to secure a standard spot. So I do think that that's a tall task for him coming into training camp and the preseason. All right, so before I close this episode out, don't forget to check out and subscribe to the spotupshot.com, the newsletter. Along with the articles I referenced in this episode on the Spurs, I also have a new section called the Spot Up Shot All NBA. I've been writing about some roster changes for various teams, and also I created a film study on Stephen Curry's ability to utilize screens to find shooting windows against defenses. Again, those are up on the spotupshot.com. And so basically, as far as how the podcast schedule will work, we're just 3 weeks out now until media day and training camp begins for the Spurs on September 29th. So my next episode should come out on Sunday, September 21st, barring any breaking news for the Spurs. And then from there, I should have weekly episodes because training camp will begin, preseason games will begin, and then, of course, on October 22nd, the regular season begins. And then here we go. We're in for another 82-game season for the Spurs and potentially the playoffs, considering that they should be a better team this coming season. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode of the Spot Up Pod. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a rating on your favorite podcast apps and our YouTube channel. The Spot Up Pod is recorded and produced by Paul Garcia. The music for this episode was written by Vincent Garcia and Paul Garcia. Thank you for listening and have a great day.